Hey guys, welcome back to Unit 2, Discussion 2. We're going to deep dive into cellular respiration. So remember, cellular respiration is the process through which cells gain the energy that they need to live. And this is performed by producers and consumers. So don't make that mistake of thinking that because producers are performing photosynthesis to make their own food, that they're not also having to break it down and use it. And this is made up of a series of reactions that take biochemical energy from food and change it into adenosine triphosphate, that ATP again. It occurs in the mitochondria. So the food that we talk about above is the glucose produced in photosynthesis. While you do break down and gain other components from food like proteins and specific biomolecules that you'll use, in order to get energy at the cellular level, it really does come from glucose. We would write the reaction for respiration as C6H12O6 plus oxygen yields 6CO2 plus 6H2O plus ATP. So notice here that this doesn't require light, but otherwise it's almost a complete reflection of that reaction for photosynthesis. Keep in mind, these are complementary processes. We've talked about those feedback loops and those balance processes before, and this is another one of them. So cellular respiration has four major steps that we're going to talk about. And if you look online and in other textbooks, sometimes it's broken down into three and you don't count the intermediate step. Sometimes it's broken down further. So for our purposes, we're going to do four steps. The first step is glycolysis, and this is where glucose gets converted to pyruvate, which is another type of molecule. We produce 2 ATP here, so charge them up from ADP to ATP, and this occurs in the cytoplasm. And last thing to know about glycolysis is that it is an anaerobic process, and this means it does not require oxygen. Now, you'll notice with these steps, I tell you four things about all of them. I tell you what the main point of the step is, if we're producing ATP and how much, where it occurs, and anaerobic versus aerobic. So please make note of that so that you're keeping track of it in your notes. Our link reaction is step 2. This is also sometimes known as the intermediate step. And that pyruvate we created in step 1 is going to get turned into acetyl-CoA, which is just, again, another molecule. And then we're going to release our carbon dioxide here. We do not produce any ATP at this step. And it is aerobic. It does require oxygen to occur. From the intermediate step, we're going to move on to step 3, which is what we call the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle. It is aerobic, so you must have oxygen here. And it's going to take that acetyl-CoA, release more carbon dioxide, and make 2 ATP. So it's essentially prepping that acetyl-CoA and prepping other components to move on to the electron transport chain, which is number 4. And this is where the bulk of our ATP is going to get made. So this is still an aerobic process. We still need oxygen here. We're still in the mitochondria. And that acetyl-CoA plus the other energy molecules that were made, NADPH, FADPH, and ATP and all of that, are going to go to this electron transfer chain, and electrons are going to get transferred from them to the mitochondrial membrane, which is going to generate a chemical and electrical gradient. And that is how we are going to take a bunch of ADP and turn it into ATP. So this is going to make 24 to 36 molecules of ATP and create the water. So this is where the bulk of it happens. And again, we've talked about briefly before those gradients. Things want to move naturally from a high gradient to a low gradient so that it levels out to equilibrium. And your cells take advantage of this in their mitochondria by doing that with these electrons, this NADPH, FADPH, and ADP, and then turning it into ATP by pushing those electrons through that gradient. So what do we do if there's no oxygen, right? Because when we look at this, when we look at cellular respiration, every step but one requires oxygen. And without oxygen, we can't get to this huge payout of 30 to 38 ATP per glucose molecule. So organisms in general have two possible solutions when you don't have oxygen. Some organisms specialize and are able to do what's called anaerobic respiration. And what happens with anaerobic respiration is they're actually able to substitute sulfate for oxygen in their chemical processes. These are deep sea creature vents or deep sea vent creatures that are able to do this, guys. This is not a normal thing. This is for organisms that have specifically evolved the ability to do so. Your other option that a lot more organisms actually have access to is to use fermentation. It makes a lot less ATP than aerobic respiration, but it does keep things going in the short term. So fermentation makes ATP when oxygen isn't available, and it does this by repeatedly doing glycolysis, which is that step one. This is most often done by archaea, bacteria, fungi, so very small things that aren't necessarily powering a whole huge body. Although I will note, your muscles will actually do this in the short term. So when you're exercising and working really hard, that lactic acid buildup comes from doing glycolysis again as the muscles are pulling more ATP than the oxygen that your body can keep up with. So this works by regenerating NAD plus to keep that glycolysis going. There's two types of this. It sub-breaks down. Alcoholic fermentation. This is typically done by yeast. It uses pyruvate to accept the electrons from the NADH to turn them back to NAD plus during that glycolysis. I know that's a lot of big fancy words, but essentially it takes that already existing molecule that gets created, takes the electrons back, and then just keeps cycling through that NADH and NAD plus. Remember, we talked about those electrons. That hydrogen is one of the easiest ones to pop on and off to create that electron. Lactic acid fermentation, this is what your muscles do, and this is when there is an oxygen debt. So it uses a pyruvate derivative called lactic acid to take those extra electrons to regenerate the NAD+. You cannot do this forever for your muscles. Your muscles and your body cannot survive on lactic acid fermentation. The lactic acid builds up if it's not flushed out, but it is a short-term solution. Alcoholic fermentation for yeast and some of the bacteria and stuff, they can survive on just fine. But again, these are simpler organisms that don't have the same ATP needs as more complex ones. All right, so in class, we are going to model photosynthesis and respiration. So start thinking about how you might represent that, how you might organize it, and then I'll see you guys in class.